Hi everyone, Nathaniel Gavronsky here, and today I want to talk to you about the way we came to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. Now, our story comes after Alexander the Great conquers the Jewish homeland of Judea in 332 BC. Now, unlike most other conquerors, Alexander the Great and the Greeks do not destroy the entire city. This was a common when you conquered a place to cement your culture over theirs, was that you destroyed what was already existing. Alexander the Great was different, and a lot of places that he would conquer, he would merge the two cultures together, and that was one of the things that allowed his army to swell with the ranks of many non-Greeks. However, shortly after he conquered Judea, he died. Now, for those of you that don't already know, what happened after that was that his empire was basically kind of broke apart as each one of his generals took a piece of it for themselves. And the two generals I'm going to talk to you about today are the ones that were basically in this area: the Ptolemy and the Ptolemaic Empire, which was what is now Egypt, and Seleucus and the Seleucid Empire, which is now where Syria is today. Now, over a 30-year period, these two empires would fight back and forth to where the province of Judea would trade hands 5 times. Now, both of these empires were Greek. They both spoke Greek. They both had the same history. So the cultural influence, no matter who was in control, was Hellenic. And in 198 BC, the Seleucid king Antiochus III was able to finally wrestle away Judea from the Ptolemaic Empire for good. Now, Antiochus III was pretty tolerant as long as you didn't cause a fuss. He didn't really care what you did, and so the assimilation of the native Jewish people was very, very passive. But during this time period, you did see a lot of building works. The government laws and rules were all written in Greek. All of the official literature was all done in Greek. You saw gymnasiums being built, and you start seeing Jews actually read the Bible in Greek. Now, for some of the more conservative Jewish faithful, this was really, really insulting. They really couldn't see how you could be Jewish and Greek at the same time. But the temple was left standing, and people were still allowed to go and visit the temple, worship in the temple. But you also had the Greek gymnasium, and that became a centerpiece of society as well. And you start seeing the dichotomy of cultures. And what the biggest difference is that what they emphasized. Okay, so the Greek culture emphasized the physical, the here and now, the material world. All right. Now, with the Jewish religion, the Jewish culture, their emphasis was more on the spiritual world, the afterlife, the eternal afterlife after this one, which is we're here preparing for that afterlife. And so the cultures had a flashpoint to where they really weren't able to merge past a certain point. But as long as Antiochus III was in charge, this really didn't come up very often, at least not in the grand scale of things. But that all changed in 175 BC when Antiochus IV took over from his father after his father died. Now, Antiochus IV was no fan of the Jews, and the passive assimilation was over. It was now no longer an option. You see the high priest be murdered in the temple, and a pro-Greek priest put in his stead. You see all observations of the Jewish faith outlawed. In fact, reading the Jewish Bible became punishable by death. It was actually in this time period that you see the dreidel actually become significant. The dreidel was a way for parents to teach their children the Jewish faith and Jewish culture and heritage through games and through like inside stories that if you didn't speak Hebrew or know the reference points, you wouldn't be no one would be the wiser. And many of the Greek soldiers and the ruling class didn't really know, and the Hellenistic Jews really just kind of for them it wasn't a reason to fuss. So that's where you start seeing, Jewish games and certain, aspects of our culture we created was in this way of being able to relay our religious and our beliefs in a time period where we weren't allowed to exhibit them, externally in society. Now, it was during this time period that Mattathias and his family left the capital city of Jerusalem and moved to a neighboring town of Modin. Now, they would be fortunate to escape the really, really strict pressures on the Jewish faithful. One of the things that was done is that they were made to break the Sabbath. You were forced to break the Sabbath. Of course, you weren't able to read the Bible. You weren't able to speak Hebrew. You had to speak Greek. But one of the biggest things that was being forced upon the Jewish people was they were going to be made to eat pig. Now, for those of you who don't know, pig, it's against the Jewish religion to eat pig. It's also against the Islamic religion to eat pig. It's not kosher. There's a lot of rules with kosher foods. I don't have time to go into all the details right now, but basically, it's rolled around in its own filth, this specific animal, and that was one of the major reasons why it wasn't seen as being an animal you could eat. It was dirty. Well, one of the religious faithful, a man by the name of Eleazar, was told that he had to eat the pig. He must sacrifice the pig to the Greek gods and eat it. And he said no, that he would not eat the pig. And why it was so important for him is that he was being watched by his entire community. And he felt his entire community, his entire society, his religion, his identity was threatened. Again, remember, the Jewish religion is in preparation for the afterlife, and violating his religious beliefs in the material, physical world would prevent him from entering into God's kingdom. And so he prepared for the afterlife. And so since he refused to eat the pig and show sacrifice to the Greek gods, he was captured, he was tortured, he was killed in front of many onlookers. Now, one of the onlookers was a woman by the name of Hannah, and she had 7 sons. She was called out. Her 7 sons were called out. They must now sacrifice a pig to the Greek gods and then must eat the pig's flesh. She refused. Like Eleazar, she understood that it was the afterlife which was important, not the physical material world, and that sacrificing her life was only going to bring her to the eternal afterlife just that much quicker. And these people, Hannah and her 7 sons and Eleazar, they were viewed centuries later in Christian Europe as being martyrs and being heroic, and they actually associated Antiochus IV with being closely related to the Antichrist. So we can see kind of in the long run who won the propaganda battle on this. But after Hannah and her 7 sons were killed, the soldiers were sent around to the neighboring communities. Modin was one of the neighboring towns. And when the soldiers got there, they set up an altar to the Greek god Zeus and ordered the townspeople to slaughter a pig to the god of Zeus, to the Greek god Zeus, and to eat the pig's flesh. This time, instead of offering themselves, to be slain, a family decided this was not going to happen. They were not going to submit to death. They were going to stand up for their religious beliefs. This is where Mattathias and his sons take charge of the situation, and you begin the Hasmonean revolt, also known as the Maccabee revolt. Now, the reason why it's called the Maccabee revolt is that one of Mattathias's sons, Judah, his nickname was Maccabee, or Hammer, and he would be the one after Mattathias's death, a year into the conflict, was able to make an allegiance with a little-known village, mostly of mud huts, in Italy called Rome. He made an alliance with them, and because the Romans hated the Seleucid Empire as much as the Jews did, they were able to work together, and Judah was able to take control of the capital city, retake the temple, And this is where the menorah comes into play. Now, the menorah of this time is quite a bit different from the menorah we see here today. The menorah was lit in the temple, and it was fed by continuously adding oil into this tray that would then allow the menorah to remain lit. It was important that the menorah remain lit because there's a connection between the menorah and fire with God. And that's a story for another day, but I will probably cover it in a future video. When the Maccabees entered into the temple, they only had enough oil for one single night, and they weren't going to be able to get any resources for a period of time because they were still in conflict with the Seleucid Empire. So they lit the menorah with what they could, and instead of being lit for one night, it stayed lit for 8 consecutive nights. Now, if you're asking why is that significant, well, this was the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. This dynasty would last 129 years. This was in a time period when empires would rise and fall, kingdoms would rise and fall in a matter of days. So this was a significant time period in Jewish history. Now, the story of Hanukkah and this specific episode is found in the books of Maccabee 1 and 2, but is not found in the Jewish Bible, basically because that had already been written. This happened centuries afterwards, and Hanukkah is talked about, briefly in passing in the New Testament as a frame of reference of other events that were taking place. And so it's unique that this is one of the most famous holidays in Judaism as far as non-Jews are concerned. So it's one they all know about because they see menorah next to every Christmas tree in every single mall. But it's actually not talked about in the Old Testament. It's not in part of the main Bible, and it's only talked about in passing in the New Testament. So it has a unique status as far as high holidays are concerned. And there's a couple of other things about this. Is that 5 years after this event, Maccabee is killed in battle as they are expanding into the borders for a buffer zone of protection from other possible invaders. But because of this, because of the strength of the Hasmonean dynasty, in 138 BC, the Roman Senate acknowledges the independence of the Hasmonean Jewish kingdom as a sovereign nation. It wasn't without its faults, though. Like all societies, it wasn't going to be without some internal turmoil. And there was a civil war that broke out between two separate sects of the Hasmonean Empire. This civil war lasts from 93 to 76 BC. And it was basically against the Hasmonean leadership and some of the minority sects. One of the most important ones was the Pharisees. Now, a couple of the main differences: the Hasmoneans had more of a close relationship between the high priest and the monarchy. They saw only the written laws of the Torah to be, important, and they viewed military expansion as being okay. Now, the Pharisees, they were, really pushing for separation between church and state. They wanted to have not only the written laws, but there were also oral laws and oral traditions that were passed down as well. And they wanted those to be included, even though a lot of other minority, sects of the Judaism saw this as confrontational, and a lot of things didn't really match up. So it was a conflict among many different small minority groups within the greater kingdom. And the Pharisees had no desire for military expansion whatsoever. And in fact, the forced assimilation of non-Jewish people into the Jewish faith is strictly prohibited by Jewish law. So this was the basic focal point of the conflict. Now, the war was ended when a new queen took the throne after her husband's death, and Queen Alexandria, she was of the Pharisees' belief system. She came up with a compromise that led peace until her death. After she died, her two sons, in confrontation with each other to take control, started another civil war. But by this time, Rome had come of age and had moved into the surrounding areas. And when one great empire sees another empire in a state of turmoil and weakness, what is one to do? In fact, it was during this time period that a contemporary Jewish historian named Josephus made this note, that because two brothers could not get along, we lost our freedom and our liberty to Rome. This is a significant a note from a contemporary historian, an observer of this time period, and I'm going to come back to this later. Because two brothers could not get along, we lost our freedom and our liberty to Rome. Luckily for the Hasmoneans, by 40 BC, Rome had its own internal turmoil when Julius Caesar was murdered in the Roman Senate. This allowed the Hasmoneans to return a king to the throne of Judea, but only for 3 years. By that time, Rome was able to regarner its strength and took over Judea and put Herod on the throne. Now, Herod the Great would be known, was known as the Great because he built many great monuments. But in the process, many aspects of what made the Hasmonean Empire unique and what made it had cultural significance for the Jewish people were torn down. And Herod answered to the emperor in Rome more than he did the will of his constituents. It was also under Herod the Great that we see the beginnings of what would be of Christianity take hold. It would be centuries before you would see another sovereign Jewish state take hold. Even though they tried, about a century after this period, they weren't able to throw off the Roman yoke. And throughout history, Jews, since this period, had been removed by force from the Holy Land. And it wasn't until much later were they able to return. And so the significance of Hanukkah is of the success of the Maccabee revolt. That Jews were going to be allowed to be Jews. And they had the power and the ability to create that sovereign state by coming together as a people. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. This was primarily just on the history of the Maccabee revolt and the history of Hanukkah.